Welcome to What's Going On with David Sermersheim. I put this podcast together just to talk a little bit about what's happening, what's going on in my life, some of my thoughts on current events, and as you'll see today, some of my thoughts on some events that happened a long time ago. But I thought we'd start with something that happened this week in 1994. The decision was made this past week, 25 years ago, to bury Charles Henry Speedy Atkins in Paducah, Kentucky. The reason that this was a big deal is that Speedy had died 66 years before. A little bit of background. I had been working for Bell South in the payphone department, and a coworker and I, in the third week of June in 1994, traveled down to the McCracken County Regional Jail to visit Cliff Gill. We were in the inmate telephone group, and we were talking to Gill about some business and looking at the account and just making sure things were going well. Well, Cliff looked at us and he said, "Hey, welcome to Paducah." And of course, I have been to Paducah hundreds of times because that's where my mom's from, and it's actually where my mom and my dad met. My coworker, Lee Rudd, had not been to Paducah, and so we were talking about some of the things that Paducah is known for. And Cliff said, "Well, boys, have you all been over to see Speedy?" We had no idea who Speedy was. Well, it ends up that the McCracken County Jail is right across the street from a very old funeral home. And, of course, I'm going back to 94. The old funeral home was owned by Velma Hammock. Her and her husband had started the funeral home so many years before, but Cliff was telling us about Speedy. Speedy was a pauper, if you will, when he died. He had moved from Tennessee to Paducah, and he had worked in the local factory of some sort having to do with tobacco work. And Charles Henry Atkins was fast at what he did, and he gained the nickname Speedy. Well, Speedy was fishing in 1928, and he fell into the Ohio River, and he drowned. Well, Speedy didn't have any family, but he did know the funeral home owner, A.Z. Hammock, Velma's husband. It was a time when Mr. Hammock had been experimenting with the mummification of those that had died. A.Z. Hammock used his own concoction, if you will, and he embalmed Speedy, and Speedy became what you would call mummified. So Speedy was never buried. Speedy hung in the funeral home, in the back, by the caskets for years and years. And for a long time, Speedy never left the funeral home. The story goes that in the 37 flood that just devastated Paducah, Speedy actually floated away, but they ended up finding him and got him back to the funeral home. So we go over to visit Mrs. Hammock at the funeral home, and I was dressed in a tie and a sport coat, and my coworker Lee was in a tie and a sport coat, and we walked over, and we walked up, and there was Mrs. Hammock behind a big desk in this funeral home, and we said, "Mrs. Hammock, we'd like to see Speedy." And she looked at us kind of funny, and she looked up at us and then looked down and said, I've never charged anybody to see Speedy." We said, "Oh, no, ma'am, we just want to, we wanted to," he said, "to ask you about Speedy and maybe we could see him." She said, I have never charged anyone to see Speedy." And I thought, boy, I don't know why. I don't know why she's thinking that. He said, well, ma'am, we're with the phone company. We were just talking to Jailer Gill, and he just said, "Hey, go on over and say hello, and maybe she can show you all Speedy." And with that, she looked up at us and completely changed her attitude and said, "Oh, well, why didn't you boys tell me?" She rang a little bell. She said to her helper, he came running up, and she said, "Can you please take the boys back to see Speedy?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am." So we walked through the funeral home, and we went into a door, and we ended up in a room full of caskets. I'm looking around. I've never been in a room full of caskets in a funeral home. Well, right about then, he takes the door that was open and begins to close it, and right behind the door is Speedy. And Speedy is in a tuxedo, and he's hanging about 3 feet above the ground, his feet about 3 feet above the ground, and what I'm looking at is a mummified human being. I couldn't believe it. I looked over at Lee, and Lee had this open mouth look on his face, and we're looking at a human being that's been gone for 66 years. He was already 50, 54, 55 when he died. So we're looking at a relic. We're looking at a preserved human being, and there was a pin on him, and we later found out that they got the pin when Mrs. Hammock took him on an airplane out to L.A. to be on the show That's Incredible. And I just looked at it, and I said, that's incredible. My buddy said it, Lee said it, and the young man showing us Speedy, I know he'd probably seen Speedy a million times, but he was still in awe. He almost had to be. So we're sitting here looking at a dead person hanging on the wall in a funeral home in Paducah, Kentucky, and we're in disbelief. I said, "Oh, he's perfectly preserved." And the assistant said, "And he's solid too." And he pounded on Speedy's chest. Speedy wasn't just preserved as skin. Speedy was perfectly preserved as organs, etc. Speedy was all right there. It was just amazing. So we leave the funeral home, and we get in the car, and we didn't even talk to each other. We were just so unbelievably shocked and amazed, and it truly was incredible. But the story's not over. I get back to Louisville, and on, I think it was late Monday, I get a call from Cliff Gill, the jailer from McCracken County, and he says, "What did you say to Mrs. Hammock? What in the world did you say to Mrs. Hammock? She has announced that she's burying Speedy." After 66 years, she announced on June 25th, 1994, 25 years ago, that after 66 years, they were actually going to bury Speedy, give him a proper burial, and they announced that it would be on August 5th. I really don't know to this day if I had anything to do with that decision. I look back and think maybe that because we were dressed up, I still don't know. I do think that maybe she thought we were the tax guys or something. It was 24, 48 hours after we got out of there that she made that decision. So Speedy gets his proper burial 66 years later. And maybe that's the way the story is supposed to end. But in a way, to this day, I think that Lee and I may have had a hand in that decision. And if that's the case, that's truly incredible. On this day in 1983, Joe Delaney passed. And if you're not a NFL football fan from back in those days, and really, if you're not a Kansas City Chiefs fan, you probably don't know that name. But Joe was one of the single bright spots in a period of time when the Chiefs didn't have a lot of bright spots. And growing up as a Chiefs fan, I really was so excited about Joe and his abilities. He came out of Louisiana, small school in Louisiana, and Joe immediately became the NFL Rookie of the Year. He was he was fantastic. The next season was kind of a waste of a season. He got injured. He had an eye injury, but then it was the short season with the strike, etc. But everyone was excited for the 83 season that was coming. But on this day in 1983, Joe was with some friends at a park in Louisiana. 3 children began to have trouble swimming. And Joe, who didn't have a lot of background swimming, Joe ended up going in after him. He did help to save one, but the other 2 passed. But in attempting to save them, Joe Delaney, running back for the Kansas City Chiefs, also passed. Over the years, Joe has received posthumously numerous honors. He's in the Kansas City Chiefs Ring of Honor, And even though his jersey, number 37, has not been retired, it hasn't been worn by a Chief since his passing. A few weeks after, President Reagan announced the awarding of the Presidential Citizens Medal to Joe Delaney. And in doing it, he said the following: born with God-given physical talent, Joe Delaney brought distinction to himself and pride to his family and friends by exemplifying the best in sportsmanship as an outstanding high school, college, and professional football player. Even more important, he set an example of citizenship off the playing field as a caring, involved member of his community of Houghton, Louisiana. On June 29, 1983, Joe Delaney, at age 24, made the ultimate sacrifice by placing the lives of 3 children above regard for his own safety. By this supreme example of courage and compassion, this brilliantly gifted young man left a spiritual legacy for his fellow Americans, in recognition of which I, Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, do hereby award Joe Delaney the Presidential Citizens Medal. On this day, 36 years later, we tip our hat to Joe Delaney. On a lighter note, Min and I went out this week, and we were trying to think about a spot to go out, and we came up with 8 Up, which is on the top floor of Hilton Garden Inn on 4th Street. We've always kind of questioned it. We love the view. Whenever we go down, we're always excited that we did, and we go out on that rooftop patio. But the menu's always been a little bit questionable. As a matter of fact, when I was going through my array of beer selections, I think I had to get down to 3 or 4 before they had one in stock. But they're kind of changing the menu around. But we split a pizza, and Minda's side of it was better than mine, a vegetable pizza. It was darn good. So, if you got some people in town and you're looking for a drink and maybe a light snack, something, some hors d'oeuvres, might be a good spot because the view is fantastic. Now, when it's 90 degrees, there's not a lot of shade. They do have some umbrellas and things like that. But, boy, if it's hot, I don't know if I'd recommend it. But as that sun is setting, it is a fantastic view of the Louisville skyline. If you're a runner or you've been a runner in the city of Louisville for the past number of decades, or you're just a follower of the different sporting events that are held, you'd be disappointed to find the information that was posted just a few weeks ago that the Louisville Triple Crown of Racing has been canceled. A lot of us that have been runners in the city for the past 3 to 4 decades have run one of those races at least. Started with the Anthem 5K, the Road City Run, and the Papa John's 10-miler, and all of it would lead up to the Kentucky Derby Festival mini marathon or marathon. But with some declining attendance and participation and sponsorship dollars drying up a bit, the decision was made to cancel those races. It's bittersweet. I guess from my standpoint, I did not run the entire Triple Crown until 2 years ago. And I got to say that it wasn't easy because the weather was terrible. There was rain and cold, there was drizzle, and then on the third one, it actually snowed there at Iroquois Park during the Papa John's 10-miler. So 2 years ago, the weather was terrible. This year, the weather was pretty good, but the schedule was kind of funky because we were in a situation, I think we had Easter and Palm Sunday late, so it wasn't much of a lead up to the mini marathon because everything was backed up about a month. So you did your 10-miler almost a month before the mini or marathon. So it was kind of messed up there too. So I think that those two things helped to lead to the decision. It helped to lead to a decrease in attendance. So I think that pretty much pulled all that in line. I know that the Louisville Sports Commission is working on some things in the fall and trying to build a group of races for the city and surrounding area. So we'll see how that goes. And I'm sure that there will be some interest, maybe those 3 races that were held leading up to the Derby Festival, Marathon and Mini Marathon, that they might be able to cobble 1 or 2 races out of that to continue to move forward. But the Louisville Triple Crown of racing as we know it is no longer. I am glad that I did it the last 2 years. You know, it'd be terrible to be sitting here a few weeks ago reading that and thinking, man, I wish I would have done that, and not having the opportunity to do it. A good friend of mine, he loves one of the steak joints here in town, and it's really gone downhill. And you know, I talked to him. He's really upset because it was a go-to. We really loved it, and he was saying the other day, he said, "Man, you know, I'm glad that I would go there, and I'm glad that that would be my go-to when it was in its heyday, when it was great, because I'd be hating to sit here right now or in the next few months or years when this thing goes downhill or ultimately closes, and saying, you know what, I hate that I never went there in its heyday, because people said it sure was a great place to go, but I never went." And the same can be said for just at least getting the last 2 years of the Triple Crown of racing in. You know, I hate that it wasn't more, but sure the heck am glad that I got it done. So, you know, I got some good memories. It was fun, and a few muscle pulls. As long as we're talking about running or racing or exercising, I read that just recently that the area west on River Road, right past 3rd and 4th Street, is going to be redone. So it's going to be a lot better towards walkers and runners and bikers, which will be great because that area is kind of a waste, and it really isn't good for biking if you want to continue on the Louisville bike loop past the Bella Louisville. It is a mess. You have to deal with those supports for I-64. In some of the pathways there, your handlebars have maybe 2 or 3 inches on each side to even get through. So it's a tough ride. It really is. So it'll be exciting what that path is going to do, what that renovation will do. It's going to go ahead and be a pathway to the new part of Waterfront Park that's being developed to the west. We'll throw one more thing out about exercising. And I guess it goes back a bit, too. When we were kids, growing up in the Crescent Hills, Orange Avenue area, there really were only 2 ways to get over towards the golf course or get up to Frankfort Avenue without crossing the wide part of Zorn Avenue. There were 2 paths. One of those paths was through the House of 1,000 Cats that would take you from, I guess that would be Brandon on back around through to Winton, and the other path would take you from Jarvis at the last house on the right before you got to Brownsboro Road, and it took you on a path past that house and past the end of Penruth, and then you'd also come out on Winton. When we take the path that went through the House of 1,000 Cats, that was always tough because almost every time 2 or 3 of them would follow us, but it would only be a couple hours that it would be at 997 because my mom and dad would make us take them back. They wouldn't let us keep them. But it was always interesting going through there. I will say, though, one time through, we did bring one home, and it stuck. And that was our first pet. And I was really young there. But over the years, the House of 1,000 Cats, they put up a fence, and there was only one path left. And it was a path where we could ride our bikes from our neighborhood area on over towards St. Leonard, cross Zorn at the small area at the top of the hill there where you had a pathway or a bike crossing or a walk crossing. So it was a safe way to get over there. That path, I know it's been there for 50 years. Well, in my running, cutting through so you don't have to go out to Brownsboro Road, I've still used that path. And in recent years, the guy that's lived in that house, Greg Nunley, has put some money into it and cut some trees and really fixed it up. So rather than over the years just closing it down, etc., he spent some money and really fixed it up. And so this morning when I was biking through, he was out trimming the side of his house from some ivy, and he stepped back and said, "Go right ahead," and stopped to thank him because as kids, we've been safe by using that trail. as an adult, I use that trail to be safe, and we just really appreciate him keeping that path open, keeping little kids and old kids from having to go out into Brownsboro Road. So I guess that's it for the end of June on what's going on. I just thought I'd throw out a few thoughts, things that are, that I've been thinking about and things that are just going on. So that is What's Going On by David Sermersheim for June 2019. Thanks for listening.